Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Rossolimo variation beginning after e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 begins the Rossolimo variation. But more importantly, today we're going to be talking a little bit about what I like to call kind of advanced opening principles. So basically that one step beyond just understanding the very basics of opening principles and how they work, and we're just going to be focusing on that and how to handle different things that black could do that really kind of step outside the box of what would be normal in a position like this. So anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button, click on your notification icon. So as you can see, kind of the plan of the Rossolimo variation is after bishop b5, we're going to play sort of like a Roy Lopez exchange type idea, where we're going to take on c6 and then we're going to go after the middle of the board. So for example, on something like g6, we're going to play bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and we're just going to castle. And our idea is to play c3 and d4 down the road and just get like a big center in exchange for our bishop pair. And that's kind of the typical Rossolimo idea, is we're playing bishop b5 with the idea of taking on c6 on almost any black move. And that's the critical thing. Almost any black move. Because there are some black moves that black can play that might preclude taking on c6. And we need to know how to respond to them. As ridiculous as it sounds, we need to know how to respond to them. Because when I show positions like this to people and I say, okay, like, what are you going to do if black just plays the knight back to b8? Right? It seems totally ludicrous, right? Like, you take your knight, you move it out, I move out a bishop, you take your knight, you move it back to b8. So everything that we know about beginner chess, all the basic principles that we learn about beginner chess, tells us that this move is just dumb. And usually we just leave it at that. Usually when we explain things to beginners, we say, look, you moved your knight out, you moved your knight back, white moved a piece out. White is up, 1, 2 tempo, and he's about to make another move. He's going to be up 3 tempo. And normally we end the discussion right here because we're trying to tell people that are playing black, we're trying to tell beginners, don't do this. This is dumb. Don't move your pieces out and then move your pieces back. But at the same time, I feel like we do need to have a deeper explanation about everything that's going on here. Because what if I'm playing the white pieces? Right? How do I take advantage of this? And this is something that I see people struggle with a lot, is they'll be up many, many tempo in an opening, or you'll see a lot of these disrespect openings where people will play h5 and h4 and rook h6 and rook back to h8, or they'll move their king back and forth, and people don't know what to do with the white pieces. They don't understand what to do. And a lot of it just comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of why they have an advantage, and it also comes from a very difficult time counting tempos. Tempos are not easy to count in chess. So, like, let me try to explain. Let me give an example. So bishop b5 gets played, right? And then they play the knight back to b8. Now, let's say that we play a move like d4, for instance. Okay? Pretty straightforward move. And now after d4, let's just say that we had something like a6 get played, bishop e2, c takes d4, knight takes d4, e6. How many tempos is white still up? Now you might say, hey, white's up 2 tempi. See, he's still up the same 2 tempi that he was up when I played knight f3, bishop b5, and that knight, went back and forth, knight c6 to b8. Now, you're saying white's up 2 tempi. This is what I think white's up. I think white's up a half a tempo. Not even a full tempo. A half a tempo. Okay, and this is why I think white's up a half a tempo after a move like d4. Because I could have reached this from a different move order. We could have reached this via this move order. We could have had e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, a6, bishop e2. And the positions are completely identical in every way except for one, which is in this position it's black's move, and in the previous position, it's white's move. So that doesn't constitute 2 tempo. That constitutes a half a tempo on the main line of the pulse and con. So this is a very advanced way of looking at stuff like this, is how many tempo are you up in relation to known positions where everybody is being equitable with their moves. So in this situation, everybody's been very equitable with their moves, and even though black hasn't moved a single piece, he's built some trenches, he's played e6, he's played a6, he's prevented the knight from going to b5 and the bishop from going to b5, he's prevented forward movement on the d5 square. So black has made significant progress with his moves, even though they're not moves that move out a piece, which is what we tell beginners. If you're not moving out a piece, you're not developing, right? But of course, we have to have a more advanced understanding of it. is you have to be equitable with your moves. If you're equitable with your moves, you're developing. If you're not equitable with your moves, you're not. So that's the more advanced concept. So here, white's only up a half a tempo on the main line. So like if we go back to knight c6, bishop b5, knight b8, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, if we're playing the white pieces, obviously we have a huge advantage. I mean, black played his knight from b8 to c6. How do we maximize that advantage? How do we not give most of that advantage away? d4 gives the majority of the advantage away. It's still an advantage. It's a half a tempo up on the main line. That's better than the main line of the pulse and con. You're up a half a tempo. So d4 isn't a terrible move. It doesn't mean you're losing or anything. But how do we fully take advantage of the fact that we're up so many tempo? Well, if we think about it logically, a lot of different variations are just going to lead to main lines where we don't have a whole lot going for us. Another thing that we have to think about is if we keep the position closed, the tempos don't matter very much. So if we play anything that keeps the position closed, like for example, let's say d3, for instance, we could have a6, b5, bishop b3, and then simply, even just bishop b7 here, or actually just about anything here. This is just going to be really close to equality, even though black is way behind on development, because the position is still closed. And now opening this position is going to require some sort of two-step. This pawn is going to have to move from d3 to d4. Similarly, if we play something that hints at a closed position, like if we play something like queen e2, for example, like queen e2, a6, bishop c4, e6. Bishop b3, just to avoid, because right now there's a threat of trapping the bishop, like b5, bishop b3, c4, or b5, bishop d3, c4 would actually trap the bishop. So we would have to spend another bishop move, then b5, then we would have to spend a move to make sure our bishop didn't get trapped, c3, and then something like bishop b7. And again, this position is very close to equality, even though white is up an enormous, not an enormous number, but 2 tempo. This is very close to equality because the position is still closed. The position hasn't opened. So what do we need to do? Well, a good instinct would be to open the position. So that's why d4, like I said, I don't think it's terrible. Like, we should try to open the position. But again, that's only a half a tempo up on the main line of the pulse and cons. So I feel like I should be getting more there. So I'm thinking in a position like this, if we think about it really logically from this whole perspective of I want to be up more than a half a tempo, and I want to eventually get an open position, and I want to take full advantage of the fact that he's lost all these tempo with knight c6, knight b8, I need to play a move like c3. And really, c3 is like almost, in my mind, like maybe the only move other than, really it's almost the only move. Because, like, even if you castled, after a6, you're retreating the bishop to some undesirable square. You're going to have to put that bishop on e2. So, because if a6 and then bishop c4, e6, you're back in the same boat where the bishop has to make another move so that it doesn't get trapped. So c3 makes the most sense because now after c3, this bishop has some very clear retreat back to the c2 square. So now if he plays a6, bishop a4, b5, for instance, you can come all the way back to c2 and not lose that additional tempo. And now you're ready to play d4 and you're ready to castle, and you're up 2 tempo on the normal Rossolimo ideas. Okay, so you're still playing kind of your normal Rossolimo, but you haven't had to exchange the bishop for the knight in order to play your castle's kingside c3, d4. And so this is how we have to think about chess, and this is how we have to think about the opening. Your normal plan was to play bishop takes knight, really just to gain that tempo, so that you could castle and play c3, d4. So now if your opponent plays a move like knight to b8, he's offering you essentially the same thing, but without losing the bishop pair. And that's what you have to do. And so I think this is a difficulty, because I see players, they get into these types of positions, and any random move under the sun might get played here. You might play d4, you might play d3, queen e2, castles kingside, knight c3. I've seen them all. But c3 is the right move. c3 is the move that maximizes your advantage and takes advantage of the fact that that knight retreated to b8. Now, there's other moves that also frustrate white's plan to play bishop takes c6. So, they could try something like knight d4, for example. And again, we have to apply our logic here. We have to use our brain. And we have to play knight takes d4, c takes d4. And then at some point, at any point, if we play pawn to c3, we should have some sort of advantage. Again, because this is very similar to the bird variation of the Ruy Lopez, where the pawn on d4 is actually a hindrance to complete our development. And we actually want to get rid of it. So even if we just play c3 right away, this should be major advantage white, because we're getting rid of this hindrance to smooth development. And now when knight c3 comes, we're going to get our center, we're going to get tons and tons of tempo. So again, thinking about how this opening relates to other openings, other known positions, other known structures, that's how we take advantage of these tempo-losing moves that avoid maybe the line that we had prepared. Okay, so what else could black do to frustrate this? Well, black could play queen c7 or queen b6. So he's saying, I'm going to take back with the queen. Well, one thing you can do is you can just let him. You can let him take back with the queen, because it's actually not much of a threat. Like, for example, you could just castle, for instance, and then say after knight f6, you could play rook e1, and then d6, you could just take on c6 anyway. Because now if queen c6, you're still gaining tempo. You're going to play e5, and then you're going to play knight takes e5, queen c7, d4. This, in theory, should still be major advantage white. It's an open position where I'm up tempo and the king is in the middle of the board, and it doesn't matter so much that black has the bishop pair in this situation, because he might not get out of the center at all. So you could still just take is one option. Another option is at some point you could try something like knight to c3 to gain tempo, or you could try something like an early d4. So for instance, after say queen c7, you could play knight to c3, which is an interesting concept because you're trying to play knight to c3 to d5. The only thing you have to watch out for in a situation like this is after e6, if you play something passive like castles, they're going to play knight g to e7, and you might not have anything at all in this position. So like after d4 takes, knight takes, knight c6, queen e3, there's next to nothing here for white. So that's the thing about playing a move like knight c3 to try to take advantage of this. And it makes a little bit more sense to play a move like knight c3 if instead of queen c7 they played something like queen b6. Now again, here you could try to play something like knight c3, and of course again the threat is knight d5, and if queen b5 we have knight c7 check with a big family fork. And knight c3 should be okay. But again, if you want to, you can just take on c6. Because nothing has really significantly changed. Like after knight c6, queen c6, you could just castle. You're not so worried about queen takes e4 because that's another tempo loss. And you should have some sort of, major advantage here, again, just because you're gaining all these tempo, and you're going to be gaining tempo against the queen. And this is how we need to think about that. But this is basically, in the Rossolimo variation, this is how you handle situations where you play bishop to b5 and your opponent finds some sort of way to prevent you from playing your normal plan of bishop takes c6 followed by castles kingside c3 and d4. This is how you would handle it, and this is how you would think about it. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.